Everyone. My name is Michael Boland. I'm Chief of Planning Projects and Programs with the Presidio Trust in San Francisco. Can everyone hear me? All right, great. Hey, Charles. Excellent foghorn. We've had the foggiest summer I can remember in San Francisco. It's global warming. Ironically, the result of global warming is San Francisco gets colder than the rest of the country, and it has been freezing. So I've heard foghorns a lot this summer, and it was a very good rendition. So I want to talk about the forest and our efforts to revitalize the Presidio forest today, which is the largest contributing feature to our landmark in San Francisco. So just a little bit, wow, a little bit saturated. I apologize for that. Just a little bit about the history of the Presidio for those of you who haven't been there. I think one of the things that's interesting about the Presidio is its long history as an inhabited place. We have Native American sites that date back to the 12th century, which on the West Coast is ancient. I think the site is probably best known because it was settled by the Spanish in 1776 when they established a garrison in the Presidio. And they established it there because it was the place you could best guard San Francisco, the entrance to San Francisco Harbor from. San Francisco Bay is the largest estuary in the West, and therefore the entrance is great strategic importance. And because of that, the site ended up being a military site for over 200 years. It was a military site first under the Spanish, then during the Mexican period, and then finally under the American period up until 1994. And this long history as a military site left this amazing architectural legacy. About 800 buildings, nearly 500 of which are historic, over 1,000 historic features. And as a result of that, the site was designated National Historic Landmark District in 1962 while it was still an Army base. And in 1972, when the Golden Gate National Recreation Area was created, it was included, even though it was still an Army base, included within the legislative boundary of the park. And in 1989, the Army decided that the site was no longer needed to defend our country and transferred to the National Park Service. Now, unfortunately, when the Army transitioned or transferred the site to the National Park Service, a lot of it looked like this. There had been, the post, though it had been extremely important for much of its history, in the last couple decades had become less important in the context of the military and had suffered from several decades of deferred maintenance. And the cost of rehabilitating the Presidio was so great, and the resources that would have been required in the context of the National Park Service so vast, that Congress created the Presidio Trust, which is the organization I work for. They gave us jurisdiction over 80% of the Presidio, though it is still part of the national park. And we have a pretty simple mandate. Our job is to preserve the resources of the park, like the Civil War era houses along Funston Street, and to use those houses as a kind of endowment that we lease to members of the public to recreate a community we think of as a national park community, one of the only national park communities in the country, both as a way of honoring the past of this place, which had so long been inhabited by individuals and their families, soldiers and families, I should say, but also as a way of supporting the park. And this is a pretty exciting week for us, actually. Monday was the beginning of our new fiscal year and is the beginning of our first year with no federal appropriation. So we've achieved self-sufficiency, which is terrifying, let me tell you. There's something really comforting about that appropriation check every year when it arrives in the mail. But I think one of the things that's really interesting about the Presidio is not only is this a long inhabited site, a site, as I mentioned, that was preserved as a national park site because of its historic resources, but woven through the fabric of this largely developed place is the best collection of remaining natural areas in San Francisco. Fragments of pre-existing, kind of pre-contact San Francisco. This is Mountain Lake, one of two natural lakes that remain in San Francisco. Representatives, segments of 13 different native plant communities. The best cross-section of what existed in San Francisco pre-contact. And it's basically there by accident. I mean, the Army, didn't develop it. It was sort of waste space. They drove their tractors and trucks and tanks all over it, frankly. But it persisted. And as a result, woven through this largely developed site, we have over 350 different native plant species. 16 of them are special status species, and 5 of them are endangered. We have about 300 different bird species using the park. The Presidio is at the tip of the northern tip of the San Francisco Peninsula, and most birds don't like to fly over open water. And so along the Pacific Flyway, birds are flying up and down the coast, and they all fly through the Presidio during their migration. So there's both this incredible diversity as a result of migration, but also because of the complexity of the habitat, incredible biodiversity, biological richness. I like to use this picture just because it gives you a sense of the complexity of the site. The site has 6 million square feet of built space contained within it. For those of you who know San Francisco, that's 10 Transamerica pyramids. It's a lot of space. In fact, one of the graphics that you saw when the Trust was created was this picture of Transamerica pyramids marching along Crissy Field, because there was a huge anxiety that we were going to completely develop the site and turn it into a condo village, which in fact would have been the outcome if had it been sold, which was what the Trust was created to stop. But you can see that the Presidio has many of the qualities of a small town. We have a daytime population of about 8,000 people now. We have our own water treatment plant and our own on-site water treatment system. We have 3 watersheds. We have 5 villages. We have a bowling alley. We have 3 chapels. We have our own police department, our own fire department. But we also have woven through the landscape all of that dark green that you see in this photo. And that dark green is the Presidio forest. Now, to manage this complex mosaic of landscapes, in 2001, the Presidio Trust and the National Park Service, which still manages about 20% of the Presidio, where'd I put that darn thing? Here we go. They manage Crissy Field, and they manage the coastal bluffs. And we manage all of this bit with all the buildings. We worked with the Park Service and developed a comprehensive vegetation management strategy for the Presidio that tried to tease apart this weird mosaic of things and develop some high-level goals for how we would take care of them, the landscape, how we would steward it going forward in an integrated way, even though it's managed by 2 agencies. And it had a couple of very simple goals. The first and foremost was to preserve this native biodiversity that remained on the site, these small fragments, mindful of the fact that the fragments that remained are too small to persist, as a result of future impacts due to public use. And so there's a lot of guidance about expanding the scale, creating linkages, creating wildlife corridors, and reconnecting these tiny fragments to create more sustainable natural systems. The second dimension of it had to do with stewarding the Presidio forest. And I'll come back and talk in more detail about the forest, but how to preserve this. You can see it here, this incredible green fringe that's woven throughout the entire post. And third, how to steward this incredible diversity of designed landscapes, historic landscapes associated with all of those historic buildings, those nearly 500 historic buildings I mentioned. Each of them has a distinct landscape associated with it that dates to the period in which the buildings were created. How do we do that and yet at the same time revitalize this as a contemporary community? And lastly, how do we manage the wildlife of the post, which doesn't really stay in the native plant community zone very well. It loves parade grounds, and great blue herons, by the way, are incredible gopher catchers, we've discovered. They spend a lot of time on all of our parade grounds eating gophers. It's the most amazing thing to watch them gulp down a gopher all at once. This is a map from the VMP, and I just want to make a couple of points before we talk about the forest. The yellow areas are the future vision for the native plant community zone. This area is very small today. It's about a quarter of the area that's shown in yellow. The historic forest zone is here in these areas that are green. And then the gray are the developed areas, these designed landscape zones. And just notice the important relationship this forest zone has in terms of connecting these 2 very large contiguous native plant community zones here that we're creating. So the VMP was designed to help us sort out a couple of dilemmas, and you've heard about a lot of them today already, but I thought I'd review a couple of them quickly because I think they're important and things that we all wrestle with. The first is that perennial question, what do you restore to? So this is one of the few pictures, one of the few photographs we have of the Presidio before it was forested. And you can see coastal prairie, coastal scrub. This is actually a pretty good representation of what the Presidio landscape would have looked like pre-contact, pre-European contact, although the Spanish did a really good job of overgrazing the site, and so it was especially dismal and dusty when the Americans took over in 1846. But this is a glimpse of a portion of one of those intact native plant zones, and you can see the sort of fairly barren. These trees are all non-native in the back. This is what the Presidio would have looked like. It doesn't look a lot like the east coast of the United States or anywhere a forest would exist. And in fact, there was no forest on the Presidio historically, again, pre-contact. In the 1880s, the commanding officer, General McDowell, ironically, was on the Parks Commission for the city of San Francisco. There was always this very comfortable kind of town-gown relationship between the Presidio and the city of San Francisco. He was on the Parks Commission and played an important role in the creation of Golden Gate Park, which is our large central park, picturesque park in San Francisco. And he was so inspired by the creation of that park and the creation of what was going on in the parks movement around the country that he decided to rethink the Presidio landscape in the sort of same terms as the transformation of Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. There also was another thing going on here. The public was so excited about Golden Gate Park and the result of it very quickly, a couple of years, it was heavily used by the public, that there was a move in Congress to force the Army to give up the Presidio to create another park. And so underneath this ambition or this desire, that he had to make this a more beautiful place was really a strategy around trying to hang on to the park. Hang on the site by the Army, which was really, you sort of make it a park but keep it Army land. So he imported a Major Jones from the East Coast, who was a landscape engineer, and came up with this strategy. And this is actually the only fragment of the strategy that we have left. This is a map. Shows a planting plan that was developed by Jones. And we also have a narrative that describes the aspirations about what he was trying to create, but have no other site plans, which is one of the dilemmas I'll talk about a little later. We have been able to, though using photographs, reconstruct the way in which the forest was actually implemented. And I want to run through a few of these pictures. Here's an early shot of the forest. You can see these very soldier-like rows of eucalyptus, blue gum, Tasmanian blue gum, and Monterey cypress trees, both non-native to the site, and the main post in the distance with its fringe of forest. And the plan had a couple of very simple aspirations. The first was to frame the gates and to grab, if you will, and define the boundaries of the post. At that point, they were undefined. And again, this was about keeping a land grab from happening. The Army wanted to keep a hold of it, so they framed the edges. And it was also about creating a sense of stateliness. Remember, the whole landscape of San Francisco was barren, and there were no trees. It was treeless. It was about blocking out views of the city. So if these trees weren't here on this ridge above Tennessee Hollow, you would see urban creep moving towards the Presidio. Again, one of those ideas Olmsted wove into the plans for Central Park. It was about stabilizing sand and planting the ridgetops to create these areas where development could happen. Again, the site was very dusty, very windswept, very miserable. There are all these period descriptions from the 1870s of how miserable the soldiers were and how they got hazard pay to come and be in the Presidio because it was such a desolate place to be. It's a little hard to imagine now, but they did. They got hazard pay because it was such a desolate place. And the forest continued to evolve from that vision. And has really become, I think, the signature element of the Presidio. In fact, we have a free shuttle system that runs downtown to pick up people. And it's wrapped in beautiful photographs of the forest because for most people, the forest is the Presidio. It's woven through the landscape. It makes the Presidio seem larger than it is. It's woven through the landscape in a way that it allows you to get lost. You don't see the city. It works in that way. But one of the second dilemmas I want to talk about first is sort of what do we restore to, which isn't still an open question we could talk about a little later. But the forest is dying. The trees that were planted, Monterey pine, Monterey cypress, only live to be about 150 years. They're a closed cone pine and cypress species. The cones pop open as a result of wildfires, which thankfully we don't have a lot of in the Presidio. So the forest is not regenerating itself naturally. And these trees only live to be about 150 years old. So because the forest was planted in about a 15-year period of time, the forest is very rapidly declining. So how to manage an asset that everyone loves, that mostly still looks like that, but we know pretty soon is going to look like that. How do we manage an asset like that and do it in such a way that we won't face the same problem again in another 100 years? Not that I'll be around working in the Presidio and have to worry about that, but how do we deal with new pests, armillaria, pine pitch canker, these things that didn't exist when the forest was planted back then, but which are now pervasive problems and creating real challenges around using the same species that were used originally. And those 3 species, by the way, were used because very little else would grow in the particular combination of climate and soil type that we find in the Presidio. In the 130 years since the forest was planted, it's become rich habitat. This is a red-tailed hawk nesting in one of those non-native pine trees. And those 300 different bird species I talked about, most of them are using this non-native woodland as a habitat. We have coyote dens in the forest. We have a whole host of small mammals that use the forest and insect species that use the forest, that feed the birds, that feed the raptors. You know the cycle of life. It's developed really rich and exciting habitat values. So how do we manage this landscape for those values? And how do we undertake what is essentially a large logging operation in the middle of a national park? It's surrounded by a very dense series of San Francisco neighborhoods. So our strategy for managing this asset really has 5 components, and I'd like to talk about each of them very quickly. The first is understand what you're managing. What we realized very quickly once we started working on the forest is we really knew very little about the forest. And we realized that we were working based on a lot of preconceptions about what the historic forest was, what parts of the forest were actually historic, what its character was, what the Army's intentions were, what the original design intent was. So unraveling that, given that we had very little to work with, we had this fragment of a plan that I showed you earlier and nothing more, some few historic photos. The Army, was into secrecy, and so they didn't really take a lot of pictures of this place. We put a lot of energy into just simply understanding the asset as it was, using historic photos, period surveys, orthorectifying them, and doing analyses like this, to look at how the forest may have changed over time, to help us understand which parts of the forest, those large patches there, which were the originally implemented historic forest, were actually the historic piece. And which of the trees that you see gradually growing all over the Presidio were actually subsequent interventions in the landscape. Because what you find based on soil type in the Presidio, you can't tell the age of a tree based on its size or on its girth. There's no consistent relationship between those factors. And so we had a very hard time actually understanding which part of the forest was actually planted as a result of this original design intent and which part wasn't. Trying to understand the designer's original intent in terms of the understory. Now, for most people, this is one of the signature characteristics of the forest, this sort of open forest, columnar trees. These are Tasmanian Blue Gum, incredibly invasive, weed throughout California, pernicious weed, but also quite gorgeous and quite wonderful. Quite stately, one of the most stately trees. In fact, that's why the Army planted them. They wanted tall trees, and there was no native that could accomplish that in this combination of soil and climate. So for most people, this is actually what the historic forest is supposed to look like. And in fact, when we did these experiments, we showed people in members of the public photos, a series of photos, and say, which of these is you think the right character for the historic forest? And they all pointed to this one. This is exactly what the forest should be. But when we actually mapped it, we discovered that well over half of it really looks like this. And we also discovered that it's in these parts, these places where there's a lot of structural diversity, a lot of actually native understory growing under non-native overstory species. These are the places where we found the highest wildlife wildlife diversity, small mammal diversity, and that though the public didn't like them, played a really important role in prompting, facilitating the movement of wildlife throughout the system. So it became really important for us to understand what generated this kind of understory. Why part of the forest looked like that, part of it looked like that. Through a series of mapping exercises, we realized it had to do with soil type, it had to do with moisture, it had to do with aspect, it had to do with management prescriptions, it had to do with location. So there was a human dimension, there was a biological or ecological dimension, and so we mapped all of those things and layered them together to help us develop a series of management prescriptions. So understand the site was the first part of our strategy, and this took us several years. Second part of our strategy, and of course we mapped 2 other things. I already mentioned we mapped biodiversity, we looked at wildlife patterns throughout the site, but we also mapped the way people were using the place. As a previous speaker mentioned, it's impossible to steward biodiversity in the urban environment without understanding people, and understanding where people want to go, and understanding how you can shape that. So one of the outgrowths of this process was a comprehensive Trails and Bikeways Master Plan for the Presidio, which helps us understand how to shape the visitor experience to allow people to go where they want to so that they're not trampling the entire understory of the forest and things like that. Second part of our strategy is a research agenda. What we learned very quickly is that nobody had really reforested a landscape like the Presidio forest for 100 years. They were starting to do it in Golden Gate Park. The landscape there is slightly different. Contemporary challenges in contemporary horticultural practice we didn't really know what to do. So we undertook a research agenda that looked at a number of things. Looked at the new pathogens and worked with UC Davis and other universities to develop disease-resistant versions of Monterey pine and Monterey cypress. Looked at what kind of native species would grow in the understory of a non-native eucalyptus stand so we could increase the structural diversity of those stands of forest. Looked at the reintroduction of certain native tree species that we thought might work in the changed conditions of the site because the forest modified the climate, modified the soil type, to see if we could actually add some structural diversity and native tree diversity to the landscape, and a whole series of other research objectives. And this research agenda continues today to help us understand the evolution of the forest and help us understand how we can better steward and manage it. Thirdly, we developed what I think of as an Indigenous horticultural strategy. And there are many dimensions of this, and I'll just talk about a few. Block removals of the forest, which you see one of the maps that show this. And the idea here was to incrementally remove pieces of the forest and replant them, and do it within contiguous areas so we could maintain that consistent scale and character of individual stands, but create more structural diversity overall in the forest. Replanting them using the original geometry, which we identified through photographs that the Army planted them, but then allowing them to grow and change and morph, and implementing the maintenance regimes that the Army had designed for themselves but never implemented, so that there's more space between the forests, so that the forest has a healthier structure and has a better chance of actually persisting over time. Fourth, we implemented a green strategy. And there are many dimensions to this green strategy. I already mentioned diversifying the understory of the forests to promote secondary plant succession in the understory and create a little more structural diversity in the future forest, and also support more bird life, wildlife habitat. The removal of invasives, we heard about that. The Army was really good at planting kind of cast iron plants in the landscape, and those have spread throughout the post and are wreaking havoc on the remaining natural areas. They're the biggest threat to them. So we've developed a volunteer program that's focused on the removal of invasive exotics in the park, and a series of management prescriptions throughout the Presidio, not only in the forest, that are really about stewarding biodiversity. So no vegetation removals during bird nesting season, and insect-friendly integrated pest management programs so we can ensure there are enough insects for birds to feed on and things like that, to make sure that we're doing our best to promote the biodiversity of bird life in the park. And a green waste recycling and milling program that we use all the trees that we remove in our program, in our forestry program, for purposes like the construction of this amphitheater at Robb Hill Campground. We compost all of the other green waste on site and reuse the compost to improve soil quality and things like that. So trying to create a complete cycle for managing the forest. The fifth and final dimension of our strategy is really a people strategy. And it's focused on engaging the public because, as is mentioned several times this morning, it's really impossible to manage a natural system or a cultural system like the forest without engaging the public, particularly one where such dramatic change is required in such a short period of time. And so we've put quite a bit of energy into our people strategy, using simple things like on-site signage, trying to explain what we're up to, weaving the forest and its history into our programs, which are focused on bringing young people in underserved communities in the park into the park and introducing them to the place and its resources. And among those resources is the forest, creating a volunteer stewardship program that allows us to engage the community in the stewardship of this asset so that they learn about it and also develop a connection to it. And also engaging in artists. Charles showed us a picture of the spire this morning. We've engaged with a number of artists in collaborations that use the trees that we're removing in our reforestation program for place-based interpretive works. This is one piece by Andy Goldsworthy called Spire. We recently finished another work with him called Woodline. Last year we also hosted a place-based temporary art program called Presidio Habitats that focused on site-specific artworks in the designed landscape in the forest. And it was designed to draw attention to the idea of the designed landscape as a habitat for wildlife. And this is one of the many pieces, and some volunteers here dumping straw back into the letters because the birds had removed so much of it to build nests that the volunteers had to come back and actually repack the letters in the middle of the forest. So in conclusion, how are we doing? It's been 10 years. We've been working on this forest revitalization program. We got off to a rocky start involving hate mail and death threats and all the things that have been alluded to already today. But we've, you know, in absolute terms, we've made some progress. We've replanted about 25 acres of the forest. The forest, by the way, is about 300 acres. I neglected to mention that. We've replanted about 25 acres. Not a lot, but again, our goal here is to take this even-age system and stretch out its lifespan over 50 years. So we're on target. You know, we're making some progress. From a horticultural standpoint, the trees are thriving. You see these little guys here just down the road from Spire. And, you know, the public hasn't mutinied, death threats aside. But we do have a few new challenges that we're facing, and it's a very interesting time after this to be a cumulative effect on the feeling of the place. We've started to get hate mail from people, again, who don't, it's not that they don't support our efforts to steward the forest, they just miss it. There's a kind of nostalgia for these really tall trees that they all grew up with. San Francisco is a very stable community. People don't move a lot. You know, sort of you move there, you never leave. And the neighborhood that surrounds the park is incredibly stable. You know, a friend of mine who lived there 80 years just passed away last year. She grew up in the house. And there's a lot of nostalgia for the place they knew. And I think that the cumulative effect of the work that we've done to protect this asset is starting to have an effect. And you know, we're tripping on people's nostalgia buttons. So those concerns aside, I'm fairly confident that we're going to be able to continue down this path, maybe slow down a little bit, maybe change a little bit, and that the you know, 2.0 version of the Presidio Forest, which is something I will never see, sadly only a few of you will ever see, will be more beautiful, will be greener, will be more biologically vital than the one that we inherited, you know, 100 years from now. So thank you.